Nell Brennan was 8 years old, and she already knew 3 things most adults never figure out. That silence gets you further than screaming, that rich people don't notice children, and that a man bleeding out in a dark alley is either a problem or an opportunity depending on how fast you can think. She found him on a Thursday night behind Dorchester Street in South Boston, face down on wet concrete, his $3,000 suit soaking through with blood from the stab wounds somebody'd put in him with real commitment, and his Patek Philippe still on his wrist, which meant this wasn't a robbery, this was a message. She didn't scream. She crouched beside him the way a stray cat approaches something it hasn't decided is safe yet, checked his pulse with 2 fingers the way she'd seen it done on the medical shows. Her Aunt Faye sometimes fell asleep watching after her second shift, and the pulse was there, thin and fading, but there. And then, Nell did something no 8-year-old should be capable of. She recognized his face. She'd seen it in the Boston Globe on the diner counter, in an article about real estate that was really about something else entirely, and the name attached to that face was Beckett Cross. And even at 8, even in a neighborhood where you learned not to say certain names after dark, Nell knew exactly what that name meant. It meant power. It meant the kind of man who could make people disappear depending on his mood. And right now he was dying at her feet, and Nell looked at him and thought, very clearly and very calmly, he owes me if he lives. So she ran. Not to the police, because in South Boston you don't call the police about men like Beckett Cross unless you want to become a problem yourself. She ran 6 blocks to the diner where her Aunt Faye was finishing the late shift. Faye Brennan, 27. 2 jobs, no savings. Hands cracked red from laundry chemicals. A woman who hadn't slept more than 5 hours a night in 3 years, because that's what it costs to raise your dead sister's child on waitress tips in a city that doesn't care whether you make it or not. Nell grabbed her wrist and said 4 words. There's a man dying. And Faye, who should have called 911, who should have walked the other way, looked into her niece's eyes and saw something there that stopped her cold. Something calculated and certain and far too old for that small face. And she went. They dragged him up 4 flights of stairs because the building didn't have an elevator because nothing in their life had an elevator. And Faye stitched his wounds with sewing thread and cheap vodka on the kitchen floor while Nell sat in the corner, quiet, her little notebook open on her lap where she wrote, Beckett Cross, Dorchester Alley, 9:47 p.m. What Faye didn't know yet was that this man owned half the city through quiet violence. What Beckett didn't know was that the girl who'd found him was already playing a game 3 moves ahead of everyone, carrying a secret she didn't fully understand but knew was worth everything. And what none of them knew, not yet, was that the most dangerous thing in that apartment wasn't the mafia boss bleeding on the linoleum. It was the quiet little girl in the corner who'd already decided he was going to save them, whether he wanted to or not. If you're hooked, and you want to see what happens when Beckett Cross opens his eyes, hit that like button so I know you're riding with me, share this with someone who loves a good story, and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter. Now let's go back to that kitchen floor, where a king is waking up, and the first thing he sees is an 8-year-old girl staring at him like she already owns him. Beckett Cross opened his eyes at 7 o'clock in the morning, and the first thing he saw was a crack stretching across the ceiling like a river on a map, a bare ceiling bulb dangling without a shade, paint peeling from the corner of the room, and the familiar, damp smell of buildings too old for anyone to care about repairing anymore. He processed the information in the order that 8 years of living in the underworld had trained him to process it. Not a hospital, because there was no smell of antiseptic. Not a morgue, because he was still breathing. Not a trap, because if it were a trap, he wouldn't have woken up. His left shoulder hurt as if someone were pressing a bar of hot iron into his flesh, and when he tried to lift his right hand to touch the wound, he realized someone had stitched him up, the sutures uneven but firm, done with thread he guessed was ordinary sewing thread. He was lying on a small bed with clean sheets that had been washed so many times they were as thin as paper, and on the nightstand sat a cheap plastic butterfly-shaped lamp that clearly didn't belong to an adult. Then he turned his head to the right and saw the little girl. She was sitting on a white plastic chair meant for a yard, the kind no one bought for a bedroom unless there were no other chairs. And she was reading a book so thick it looked bigger than her thighs. She didn't look up right away. She finished the sentence she was reading first, then closed the book, marked the page with a small sticky note. and looked at him with bright blue eyes that showed no sign of fear or surprise, as if she had been sitting there waiting for him to wake up, and this was only an event she had predicted would happen right on time. "My aunt said you're not allowed to move," the little girl said, her voice steady and clear, as though she were reading a line of instructions from a medicine box. "The stitches will tear open. She said if you move, she won't sew you up a second time." He looked at the little girl, and the little girl looked back at him. And in those 3 seconds, Beckett Cross realized something it would take him many more weeks to fully understand the importance of. This child wasn't afraid of him, not because she didn't know he was dangerous, but because she had decided he was more useful than frightening. Footsteps came from the kitchen, and then the woman appeared in the doorway. Faye Brennan, reddish-brown hair tied up in a messy knot, old jeans and a thin t-shirt smelling of coffee and laundry soap, carrying a glass of water and 2 pain pills that he guessed were the cheapest kind available at CVS. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw the thing he had been trained to recognize in everyone he met: calculation. Not the calculation of greed or fear, but the calculation of someone weighing exactly how much trouble she had just dragged into her home and how much more she could bear. "You're alive," she said. And it wasn't congratulations. It was a statement of fact. The stab wound didn't hit anything important. "You lost a lot of blood, but I stopped it. You had a mild fever last night, but it's gone down." She set the glass of water and the pills on the nightstand beside the butterfly lamp. "Drink. Don't ask me who I am. Don't tell me who you are. Don't call anyone. Not yet." Beckett looked at her and realized she was giving him orders, and the strangest thing wasn't that she dared to give them, but that he found himself wanting to obey. "No one knows I'm here," he said, his voice rough from dehydration and too much silence. "Keep it that way," she said, then turned back toward the kitchen as if the conversation was over, because she was the one who decided when it ended. While Beckett Cross lay in the 4th-floor walk-up apartment in South Boston and swallowed cheap painkillers from CVS, on the other side of the city, inside a sealed room on the 32nd floor of a building on Atlantic Avenue, Conrad Yates was standing before 6 men and trying to control a panic he refused to let anyone see on his face. The boss was missing. 14 hours had passed with no contact, no signal, no body, no news. Beckett's phone was either turned off or destroyed. His car was still parked at the restaurant on Newbury Street, where he had eaten dinner before disappearing. Conrad had sent men to check every hospital, every morgue, every police station within a 50-mile radius, and the answer was the same everywhere. No one matched the description. That meant Beckett was either dying somewhere no one had found yet, or alive somewhere no one had thought to look, and Conrad didn't know which possibility frightened him more. In the opposite corner of the room, Warren Shaw sat with the proper look of concern, in exactly the proper measure, both hands folded together on the table the way a loyal financial advisor should sit when the boss had gone missing. But under the table, his second phone vibrated softly, and the message on the screen contained only 2 words from a number without a saved name. "Confirm completion?" Warren waited until no one was looking, then typed 3 words back beneath the table: "No body found." And across the city, in an office on the top floor of another building overlooking Boston Harbor, Pierce Alderman read those 3 words on the screen of his phone and did not smile, because Pierce wasn't the kind of man who smiled when he received bad news. But he didn't grimace either, because no body found meant it wasn't finished yet, and Pierce Alderman was the kind of man who always finished what he had started. The fever came on the first night, and dragged Beckett down into a dark place where he couldn't tell whether he was sleeping or dying. He only knew that every time he tried to rise to the surface, the world appeared in broken fragments, like a film cut at the wrong rhythm. The dull yellow kitchen light at midnight, and someone's hand laying a wet towel on his forehead, then darkness again. Then daylight slipping through thin curtains, and the sound of small feet moving through the room very softly, as if afraid of waking him. Then darkness again. Then the smell of some kind of porridge cooking on the old gas stove, and Faye's quiet voice telling Nell to eat. Then do her homework. Then darkness again. But each time he surfaced and his eyes stayed open long enough to see, he looked, because that was an instinct 8 years couldn't turn off. And what he saw inside this apartment told him a story no one had to open their mouth to tell. He saw Faye leave the house at 6 o'clock in the morning while it was still dark, wearing a thin coat even though it was cold outside, then return at noon with her hands redder than when she left, because her morning shift was at the laundromat, where she soaked her hands in chemicals for 8 straight hours. He saw her cook lunch for Nell out of things it took him a few seconds to recognize as a meal, and not leftovers. White rice with a little canned vegetable, and sometimes an egg that she always gave whole to Nell while she ate plain rice herself. He saw her leave the house a second time at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to go to Floyd Mooney's diner, the 58-year-old Irishman he heard Nell mention once, in a rare, familiar voice, reserved for someone outside the family, and she didn't come home until 10 o'clock at night, and when she did, her cheap shoes dragged across the wooden floor with the sound of someone who had reached the far edge of her strength, but still had to check the bandage on the stranger lying in her bed before she was allowed to collapse into the armchair, in the corner of the living room, which he now understood was where she slept every night since he had taken over her bed. He saw the rent increase notice taped to the door, which she peeled off, folded, and tucked into her pocket as if hiding it would make it less real. He saw the refrigerator that Nell opened every morning and stared into for about 2 seconds before closing it again and taking a glass of plain water instead of anything else, because there was almost nothing inside except a thin tub of butter and half a carton of milk. He saw Nell's sneakers, the left sole worn down at an angle, making her walk slightly unevenly, though she never said a word about it. And he saw Nell. She was the part that made him the most awake whenever the fever allowed it, because she unsettled him. On the second day, when the fever had dropped enough for him to sit with his back against the wall and drink water, Nell sat down in the familiar white plastic chair, opened her small notebook, and began asking him questions no 8-year-old child should ask a stranger. "Where do you live?" she asked, without looking up from the notebook, as if the question were only small talk. "Far from here," he said. "How far?" "Far enough. How many people work for you?" He looked at her, and she still didn't look up, but the fingers holding the pencil paused for one very small beat, enough for him to know the answer mattered to her more than her face showed. "Why do you think I have people working for me?" he asked. "Because of your watch?" Nell said. "Because of your shoes. Because of the way you looked around the room the first time you opened your eyes. You looked at the door first, then the window, then me. Normal people look at people first. You looked for exits first." She lifted her eyes, and those blue eyes looked straight into his, and he felt something he didn't often feel in his line of work, being read. The third day. The fever had almost completely withdrawn. Faye came home from the laundromat earlier than usual, and sat beside the bed to change his bandage. And when she removed the old cloth and laid the new one over the wound, he saw her hands clearly in daylight for the first time. They were red, cracked, the skin peeling at the knuckles, some places oozing blood in the spaces between her fingers, and they looked like the hands of someone who had dipped them into diluted acid every day for years. "What do you do that makes your hands like that?" he asked, and it was the first question he had asked about her instead of about his own condition. Faye didn't look at him. She looked toward the kitchen table, where Nell was doing math with a pencil worn so short she had to hold it with 3 fingers, and she answered in a voice with no self-pity in it, only naked truth. "Laundromat from 6 to noon, diner from 3 to 10. 7 days a week. 3 years now." "Why?" he asked, though he already knew the answer, but he wanted to hear her say it. "Because that little girl is everything I have," Faye said, and she said it the way people say things that need no further explanation, because they are so true that any extra word would be unnecessary. Beckett stayed silent for a very long time. The kitchen was silent. There was only the sound of Nell's pencil on paper, the old refrigerator humming, and the city outside the window living its own life without caring about the 3 people in this room. Then he spoke, and when he did, it was the first time in 3 days he said something real, instead of answers just sufficient enough to reveal nothing. "My name is Beckett Cross." Faye's hand stopped halfway along the line of stitches. She didn't look up right away. She stopped for about 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, he saw her back go rigid and her shoulders lift by 1 centimeter, and he knew she knew that name. She knew exactly what that name meant, and she was processing the truth that what she was sheltering inside her home wasn't a wounded man, but a bomb. She lifted her head, looked at him, and in her eyes there was none of the fear he was used to seeing in people when they heard his name, only the deep exhaustion of someone too familiar with life throwing one more thing onto the pile of burdens on her shoulders. "I need to throw you out of my house," she said. "Maybe you should," he said. She looked at him a moment longer, then looked over at Nell, sitting at the kitchen table still doing math as if nothing in the world mattered more than division with remainders, then looked back at him, and she said in a voice so calm it was almost frightening, "But I won't, because that's not who I am." Then she went back to changing his bandage as if she had just decided something about the weather, not decided to let a mafia boss stay in her home with her 8-year-old niece. On the morning of the 6th day, Beckett was finally strong enough to sit up without support, and he knew he could not risk a single hour more while his empire remained in the hands of a traitor. He asked Faye if she had a phone, and she handed him an old one with a cracked screen, one that forced him to press the number twice because the 3 key no longer worked, and he called a number that only 2 people in the world knew. When Conrad Yates answered, the other end of the line stayed silent for about 5 seconds, a silence Beckett understood, as Conrad processing the truth that his boss was alive in exactly the way Conrad processed everything. No shouting, no sigh of relief, only silence until emotion had been folded neatly back into its proper place before he spoke. Beckett gave him the address and told him to come alone, bring no one, tell no one, and within the hour, a heavy knock sounded at the door. A sound Nell reached before Faye could intervene, sensing the arrival of the world Beckett belonged to. Conrad Yates stepped into the tiny 4th-floor walk-up apartment in South Boston, 52 years old, with short salt and pepper hair, wearing a dark coat, and everything about him, from the way he stood to the way his eyes swept the room in 2 seconds, gave off something Faye recognized instantly. This was a dangerous man. Not dangerous in a loud way, but dangerous in a quiet way, in the way of someone who had done things ordinary people only watched in movies, and had done them enough times that he no longer lost sleep over them. Conrad stood at the door and assessed with his eyes. His boss, sitting on a small bed, with stitches made from sewing thread, visible at the collar of his shirt. A thin woman with reddish-brown hair standing beside the kitchen, staring at him without blinking with the look of someone ready to grab a knife if necessary, and a child sitting at the corner of the kitchen table, holding a notebook to her chest as if it were a shield. "Conrad," Beckett said, and that name alone, together with the voice Conrad had heard for 15 years, was enough for him to understand everything he needed to understand about his boss's condition. "She saved my life," Beckett said, looking toward Faye. "The little girl found me." And he looked toward Nell. Conrad looked at Faye, then at Nell, then back at Beckett, and he gave a single nod, the kind of nod Faye understood as the greatest thank you this sort of man knew how to offer. "Does anyone know you're here?" Conrad asked Beckett, his voice low and controlled. "No. Who did it?" "Someone inside. They knew my schedule that night, knew I was alone, knew the route I walked from the restaurant. It wasn't an outsider." Conrad fell silent, and Faye saw his jaw tighten, and she understood that someone inside was worse than any enemy on the outside, because it meant the traitor was sitting at the same table, eating from the same dish, and knew everything needed to do it a second time. "I'll handle it," Conrad said. "Not yet," Beckett said. "I need to know who it is first. If we handle the wrong person, the real one will know and run. Wait until I come back." Conrad nodded, and in his eyes was an old-fashioned respect for a man who, even after being stabbed and nearly killed, still thought more clearly than most people did when they were healthy. Then Beckett looked at Faye and said, "I owe you." Faye was standing with her back against the kitchen counter, arms crossed over her chest, and she looked at him with the gaze he had begun to recognize as the way she looked at everything. Straight on, without dodging, without adding anything, and without taking anything away. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I did it because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted something from you. Let me send money," he said. "Or let me move you somewhere better. No, you're living in a 4th-floor apartment with no elevator, an empty refrigerator. No. And working 2 shifts 7 days a week until your hands crack open and you're saying no?" "I'm saying no," Faye said, and she said it as if closing a door. The room went silent. Conrad stood near the door, watching. Beckett looked at Faye. Faye looked back at Beckett. And then a small voice rose from the corner of the kitchen table, clear and precise, and so perfectly timed that if Beckett hadn't known she was only 8 years old, he would have thought this was someone who had been negotiating all her life. "Aunt Faye wants to open a bakery," Nell said without lifting her eyes from her notebook. "She makes the best cakes in this neighborhood. Like, She applied for a loan at the bank before, but they turned her down. She never talks about it, but I saw her cry once after she got the letter. Silence. The kind of silence so heavy, Faye felt it pressing against her chest. She looked at Nell, and on her face 2 things were fighting at once. Tenderness, because this child loved her enough to remember a detail she had thought no one knew, and the desire to cover her niece's mouth immediately because the girl had just spoken the most private part of her life in front of 2 men Faye didn't trust. But Beckett wasn't looking at Faye. He was looking at Nell, and in that moment, he looked at the little girl with the eyes of a man who had spent 8 years sitting across tables from the best negotiators in the business, and he realized the child hadn't said this by accident. She had chosen the exact moment, when Beckett had just offered to repay a debt and Faye had just refused, when the conversation had reached a dead end and needed someone to open a third door. She had chosen the right information, not asking for money because she knew Faye would be angry, but offering a specific dream that could be turned into a plan. And she had chosen the right method, saying it as if she were merely sharing rather than asking, so Beckett would be the one to decide to turn it into action. The 8-year-old girl was negotiating, and she was doing it better than 90% of the grown men he had ever sat across from. And Beckett Cross smiled. It was the first smile since he had opened his eyes on the small bed, with sheets as thin as paper and a butterfly-shaped nightlamp, and it changed his face completely. The crease between his brows loosened, the cold cut of his jaw softened, and for about 2 seconds he looked like someone else, someone who might have existed before 8 years of power and violence buried him under concrete. Conrad, standing by the door, saw that smile and said nothing, but his eyes narrowed slightly in a way that only people who had known Beckett Cross for a very long time would recognize as surprise. Beckett delayed his final departure until that afternoon, waiting until Faye had left for her second shift at the diner, and Nell was occupied with her studies, preferring to disappear as quietly as he had arrived. He left the bed neatly made, the sheets and pillows folded into place, and a piece of paper on the kitchen table with only 2 words written on it. "Thank you." He knew it wasn't enough, but he also knew any more words would be wrong, because Faye Brennan wasn't the kind of person who needed pretty speeches from a man like him. Conrad picked him up at the end of the street in a black car with dark tinted windows, and when Beckett slid into the back seat, the world changed in a single second, from cracked wooden floors and an empty refrigerator and a butterfly-shaped nightlamp to soft leather seats, cold air conditioning, and the smell of expensive car fragrance that he had grown so used to he no longer noticed it until today. After 6 days of smelling cheap laundry, soap, and porridge cooked on an old gas stove, suddenly, he could smell it again, and it smelled like meaninglessness. His penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the building on Harbor Boulevard, with glass stretching from the floor to the ceiling and a full view of Boston Harbor. Furnished by someone, Beckett had paid more than Faye's yearly wages simply to choose the right shade of gray for the sofa, and when he stepped inside, everything was exactly as it had been when he left 6 days earlier, because no one lived here enough to disturb anything. He stood in the middle of a living room larger than Faye's entire apartment, and looked out through the glass at the city spread beneath him, and he remembered Nell's voice asking, "Where do you live?" And he thought the most accurate answer probably wasn't an address, but alone. But Beckett Cross didn't have time to stand in front of glass walls and think about loneliness, because someone had tried to kill him, and that person was sitting inside his organization, thinking he was dead. He summoned Conrad into his office, and for the next 2 hours they went through every detail. Who knew his schedule that night? Who knew he was walking alone from the restaurant on Newbury Street? Who had a reason? The list was short, and Warren Shaw's name was on it not because there was clear evidence, but because Warren was the financial advisor, the only person besides Conrad who knew Beckett's detailed schedule day by day, and because Conrad said, in a very low, very controlled voice, that he had noticed Warren taking strange phone calls twice during the week before the ambush, and both times Warren had left the room to answer. Not enough. Not enough to act. And Beckett knew that if he was wrong, if he dealt with the wrong man, then the real traitor would know he was suspicious and would disappear, or worse, would try again, and next time, he wouldn't use a knife. He would use something Beckett couldn't get back up from. So he chose the method he had used for 8 years to survive in this world. Waiting. He returned to the organization, as if nothing had happened except an unexpected trip. He looked at Warren with the same eyes he had always used to look at Warren. He spoke to Warren in the same voice he had always used, and he waited for Warren to make his own mistake, because traitors always made mistakes if you gave them enough time to believe they were safe. But while he played chess with the man who wanted him dead, he also did something else Conrad noticed before Beckett admitted it to himself. He kept his word. 2 weeks after he left the apartment, an envelope was sent to Faye Brennan's address through regular mail, with no sender's name. Inside was the lease for a small shop on the corner of East Street, 3 blocks from her apartment, a ground floor space in a quiet neighborhood with foot traffic, rent significantly below market rate, a 5-year contract, and every document in Faye Brennan's name. No note, no explanation, none needed. Faye sat at the kitchen table and looked at the stack of papers for a very long time, and she understood, with the instinct 3 years of living in South Boston had taught her, that this wasn't charity, and this wasn't a gift. This was how Beckett Cross repaid a debt, and in his world, refusing a debt that had already been repaid was an insult to the person who paid it. Faye Brennan might not understand the underworld, but she understood respect when she saw it. Nell sat across from her, watching her aunt turn each page of the contract, then opened her small notebook and wrote 3 words she underlined twice. He kept his word. The bakery opened 4 weeks later. It was small, with only 6 tables and a glass display counter and a kitchen in the back that Faye cleaned, painted, and repaired by herself, because she couldn't hire anyone except her own 2 hands. On the first day, she sold 9 cakes, and on the second day, she sold 14, and by the end of the first week, she had sold out before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because Faye Brennan's cakes were truly good. Not good in the way of expensive restaurants, but good in the way that made people remember the kitchen of their childhood homes, and that was the kind of goodness no money could buy. Beckett came by for the first time during the second week, and he told Conrad he was checking on his investment, and Conrad said nothing because Conrad was the kind of man who knew when he should say nothing. Beckett sat at the corner table by the window, ordered black coffee, and Faye brought him a cup of coffee in a ceramic mug that didn't match any other mug in the bakery because she had bought them from a thrift store. She set it down on the table and said, "The coffee here isn't like what you're used to drinking." And he took a sip, and it truly wasn't like what he was used to drinking. It was better, not because of its quality, but because it had been made by the hands of the woman who had sewn him up with clothing thread on a kitchen floor and asked for nothing in return. He came by a second time that weekend, a third time the following week. By the 4th time, he didn't need a reason anymore, and Conrad didn't ask anymore. He sat at the corner table and drank Faye's coffee and looked out the small window at the South Boston sidewalk, where people walked and led dogs and carried grocery bags, and lived lives so ordinary they were almost invisible, and Beckett realized that for the first time in many years, he was sitting in a place where no one knew who he was, no one feared him, no one wanted anything from him except $4 for coffee, and the feeling was like taking a breath he hadn't known he had been holding all this time. It began with the cinnamon pastry. The 5th time Beckett came to the bakery and sat at his usual corner table, Nell appeared from the kitchen carrying a small plate with a cinnamon pastry fresh from the oven, still giving off steam. She set it in front of him without saying anything, then sat down in the chair across from him and opened her book to read, as if she had simply happened to choose this exact table rather than doing it on purpose. Beckett looked at the pastry, then at the little girl, then back at the pastry, and he ate it because it was good, and because refusing a cake from an 8-year-old child was something even he wasn't cold enough to do. The 6th time, she brought out chocolate cake. The 7th time, it was lemon cake with sugar glaze. The 8th time, she didn't bring cake. She brought another book and sat across from him, reading in silence for 40 minutes without saying a word, and when he stood up to leave, she lifted her head and asked, "Have you read this one?" Then held up the cover for him to see, a thick detective novel he actually had read many years before. He said he had, and she said, "The villain is obvious from chapter 3, if you notice how the author describes his eyes." And it was such a subtle observation that he stopped halfway through his step and looked at her again, because he had noticed the same thing when he read it, but he had been 36 years old when he noticed, and she was 8, the 9th time, the 10th time. Every time Beckett came, Nell was there, consistent as a clock, reliable as sunrise, and she never asked for anything, not money, not gifts, not attention. She was simply there, bringing cake, reading books, occasionally asking a brief question about a book or the weather or some random fact she had read somewhere, then returning to silence. She was so perfectly well-behaved. That was when Beckett began to hear an alarm bell ringing in his head, not the kind that warned of danger, but the kind that warned something was happening beneath the surface that he hadn't yet seen clearly. Because Beckett Cross had lived 8 years in a world where everyone he met wanted something from him, where every smile had a price, every handshake had a condition, every kindness was the opening move before a request, and he had developed the ability to read human intention the way people read a menu, quickly, accurately, and never surprised by the final dish. And when he put it all together, the picture emerged so clearly that he almost found it funny. Nell Brennan wasn't appearing every time he came by accident. She wasn't accidentally bringing the exact kind of cake he liked after watching him try different kinds. She wasn't accidentally asking about books to create a thread of connection between them. She was playing a long game, the kind of game that in his world people called the long game, the kind where you didn't ask for anything today or tomorrow or next week. You simply showed up and showed up and showed up until your presence became the other person's habit. Until the other person started looking for you when you weren't there. Until the empty space you left behind became larger than the space you took up. Nell was trying to make him attached, not with tears or pleading or pity, but with usefulness, with pleasantness, by slowly becoming something he didn't know he needed until it was gone. And what surprised Beckett wasn't that she was doing this, but his own reaction to it. He should have been wary. He should have looked at her the way he looked at everyone in his organization when they seemed too loyal too quickly, with cold suspicion. But he wasn't wary. He was impressed. An 8-year-old girl was playing the long game better than most of the grown men in his organization. Men who had lived in this world for 20 years, 30 years, and still didn't have enough patience or enough intelligence to play it well. And he decided something he knew might be a mistake. But he decided it because for the first time in a very long while, he wanted to see what would happen if he didn't stop it. He let her continue. One Saturday afternoon, sunlight slanted through the bakery window and fell across the tabletop in a long golden stripe. Nell sat across from him with her book folded face down on the table, and she wasn't reading. She was looking at him, and this time, she asked a different question, one that didn't belong in the script of cake and books and comfortable silence. One that Beckett would remember long after that afternoon ended. "Mr. Beckett, do you have children?" "No. Do you want children?" Silence. Not the kind of silence he used to control conversations during negotiations, but the true silence of a man who had just been asked a question he had never allowed himself to think about, because thinking about it meant admitting that the life he was living lacked something that 8 years of power and money couldn't fill. "I've never thought about it," he said, and that was the truth. "Then you should start thinking about it," Nell said, in a tone as ordinary as if she were telling him he should try a new kind of cake. Then she turned her book back over and continued reading from the page she had marked, and Beckett sat at the corner table of the small bakery in South Boston with his cold coffee and the stripe of sunlight on the table, looking at the 8-year-old child reading across from him, and he thought this was probably the most dangerous negotiation he had ever lost, because he was losing and he didn't want to win. Faye Brennan's bakery had no name because she didn't have enough money to make a sign, so she simply wrote the 2 words, "Fresh Cakes," in white chalk on a small blackboard placed outside the door, and it turned out that was all she needed, because by the 3rd week, people in the neighborhood were already calling it Faye's Place, and no one needed a sign when the cakes spoke for themselves. She worked 16 hours a day, waking at 4 o'clock in the morning to knead dough and bake the first batch before opening at 7 o'clock, and she stood behind the counter until 8 o'clock at night, when the last cake was either sold or put away, and her hands were still cracked, but now they were cracked from flour and oven heat instead of laundry chemicals. And there was a difference between those 2 things that only people who had lived through both could understand. One thing destroyed her, the other built her. For the first time in 3 years, Faye Brennan was working for herself, and she felt something she had forgotten the name of until it came back. And its name was pride. Beckett came regularly, every 3 or 4 days, always sitting at the corner table, always ordering black coffee, and between the 2 of them, something began to form that neither of them named but both recognized. Conversations longer, deeper, and more real than any conversation Beckett had with anyone in his world. Because Faye wasn't afraid of him. And more importantly, Faye didn't pretend. One afternoon, he mentioned a real estate deal under negotiation, a surface story he used with everyone outside the organization, and Faye set his coffee cup down on the table, looked at him and said, "Beckett, I'm not pretending you sell real estate. Don't pretend with me either. If we're going to talk, then we talk honestly, or we don't talk at all." He looked at her, and for about 2 seconds, he didn't know what to say, because he was so used to people accepting the shell he handed them, happily believing the surface story because believing it was easier than facing the truth, and this was the first time someone had looked straight at that shell and said, "No, I'm not joining this game." "Fine," he said. "No pretending." "Good," she said, and carried the coffee away to serve another table, as if she had just established the most important rule between them in exactly 10 seconds. And from that day on, they told each other the truth, not the whole truth, because there were parts of Beckett's life that she didn't ask about, and he didn't tell. But truth, at a level both of them accepted. He didn't explain his work and she didn't ask him to explain it, but whenever they spoke about anything else, they spoke in the voices of people who had agreed that truth was the only currency with any value between them. Then, one Friday night, near the end of the month, while Faye was closing the bakery and Nell was sitting at the familiar corner table doing her homework, Beckett walked in and said he wanted to invite aunt and niece to his home for dinner. A proper thank you dinner. And Faye looked at him with a gaze that was both suspicious and curious and said, "Where is your home?" And he said, "I'll send a car." And Faye wanted to refuse. But Nell had lifted her head from her homework, and her eyes lit up in a way Faye rarely saw because Nell almost never let her excitement show, and because of Nell, Faye said yes. The car picked them up at 7 o'clock that evening, the familiar black car driven by Conrad, and when the private elevator opened on the top floor and Faye stepped into Beckett Cross's penthouse, she stood still for about 5 seconds and said nothing. Glass from floor to ceiling, the whole Boston skyline spread out before her, like a painting someone had made out of lights. Dark wooden floors polished so brightly she could see her shoes reflected in them, a marble kitchen larger than her entire apartment, and everything so perfectly clean it felt sterile, in the way only places where no one truly lived could be clean. Faye walked to the middle of the living room, stood before the glass wall, looked out at the city below, and said 2 sentences Beckett would remember longer than any threat or praise he had ever heard in 8 years sitting on a throne. "Beautiful," she said. Then she paused. But lonely. He stood 3 steps away from her, and he didn't argue, because there was nothing to argue with when someone spoke a truth you already knew but had never heard put into words. And Faye Brennan had just put into words the thing this penthouse had been shouting at him every night when he walked in, and heard only the sound of his own footsteps echoing across the wooden floor. Meanwhile, Nell explored the penthouse with the methodical silence Beckett had grown used to recognizing in her. She didn't run around or cry out. She moved from room to room and observed everything with eyes that remembered every detail, and she stopped in front of the enormous bookshelf in his office, a shelf that filled an entire wall from floor to ceiling and was packed with books. She stood there tilting her head, reading the spine of each book for a long while, then returned to the living room where Beckett and Faye were standing, and she spoke in the ordinary voice Beckett now knew was the voice she used when she was about to say something not ordinary at all. "You have a lot of books," Nell said, "but you don't have any children's books." Beckett looked at her. "Because no children live here. Not yet," Nell said. 1 word, 1 syllable, and it hung in the air of the vast, lonely penthouse, like a bullet that had been fired but had not yet reached its target. And Beckett looked at the little girl, and the little girl looked back at him with bright blue eyes that didn't blink, and Faye stood beside them and heard all of it, and she looked at her niece and then at this man, and she understood that Nell's long game wasn't only about cakes and books and pleasant silence. It was much bigger than that. It was about a roof. It was about a family. It was about the word yet, which an 8-year-old child had learned to say in place of please, because she had understood very early that people could refuse please, but not yet meant it would happen. Only the time had not come. The evidence arrived on a Tuesday night, when Conrad placed a second phone on Beckett's desk, a phone the technical team had copied data from, after finding it in the locked drawer of Warren Shaw's desk at the office on Atlantic Avenue. And inside that phone were 17 messages sent to an unsaved number over the 6 weeks before the ambush. 17 messages that, when read in chronological order, told a story so clear it needed no translation. Beckett's schedule on that Thursday night, the name of the restaurant on Newbury Street, the time he left, his habit of walking alone, the route he usually took, and the final message, sent at 6:45 in the evening on the night he was stabbed, containing only one word, ready. Beckett read the 17 messages and said nothing for about 3 minutes. 3 minutes during which Conrad stood still on the other side of the desk and waited. Because he knew Beckett Cross's silence, after reading proof of betrayal, wasn't the silence of anger, but the silence of calculation. And once Beckett finished calculating, everything had already been decided before he opened his mouth. Call Warren here, tonight, alone, he said. F, 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 F. Warren Shaw walked into Beckett's office at 9 o'clock that night, with the ordinary expression of a financial advisor called in for an after-hours meeting, 34 years old, gray suit, perfectly knotted tie, a smile just confident enough and just humble enough, the smile he had practiced throughout 4 years working inside the Cross organization so he could become the man everyone trusted and no one suspected. Beckett sat behind the desk. He didn't stand. He didn't offer him a seat. He placed the second phone on the desktop, the screen facing Warren, already open to the first message. Warren looked at the phone, and the smile on his face died the way a candle dies when someone opens a window. Not slowly, but extinguished in a single second. I know, Beckett said. Go. 4 words. No shouting. No threats. No explanation. 4 words, and Warren understood that this wasn't a negotiation, but a sentence, and the sentence was that he would be allowed to live on the condition that he disappeared and never came back. Warren stood there for about 5 more seconds, long enough for Beckett to see 20 different things move through his eyes. Shock, fear, the calculation of whether there was anything he could say to change the situation, then the realization that there wasn't, then acceptance, then departure, not another word, the door closed, footsteps faded down the hallway, and Beckett sat alone in the dark office and looked at the phone on the desk and knew that in his world, what he had just done was so unusual, it would become a story told again and again, because Beckett Cross had caught the traitor who had tried to kill him, and he had let him live. Conrad knew. Conrad had stood outside the door through the entire meeting, and when Warren passed him without looking up, Conrad watched his back vanish into the elevator, then stepped into the office and looked at Beckett, and on his face was an expression Beckett had never seen in 15 years. Not surprise, because Conrad was rarely surprised, but recognition, a quiet recognition that something had changed in the man sitting behind that desk, and he knew what had changed it, or more precisely, he knew who had changed it, a reddish-brown-haired woman who sold cakes in South Boston, and an 8-year-old child with a small notebook. 2 people doing simply by existing in Beckett Cross's life what 8 years of power and violence and loneliness hadn't been able to do. Conrad didn't say that aloud. He only said, Warren will run to Alderman. I know, Beckett said. Let him run. And that was exactly what happened. Warren Shaw disappeared from Boston that night and appeared on the other side of the city the next morning, in Pierce Alderman's office on the top floor overlooking the harbor. Pierce Alderman, 40 years old, with slicked-back hair, a tailored suit, and a Harvard law degree hanging on the wall beside photographs with 3 senators, the kind of man who never dirtied his hands because he paid other people to dirty theirs for him. Warren brought Pierce what Pierce wanted to hear. Beckett Cross was changing, going soft, losing focus, spending time at a small bakery in South Boston with a woman named Faye Brennan and her 8-year-old niece named Nell, and instead of killing the traitor, he had let him go, and in this world, Mercy was the clearest sign of weakness. Pierce listened. And Pierce didn't rush. Because Pierce never rushed. He was the kind of man who played chess where every move took months, and every captured piece was a life. And he said only one sentence to Warren: "Find out everything for me about those two women." And in South Boston, inside the small bakery with no sign, Faye Brennan was wiping the counter before closing and didn't know that she had just become a chess piece on a board she had never agreed to play on. Faye realized she was being watched on a Wednesday morning when she opened the bakery at 7 o'clock and saw a black sedan parked across the street that she had never seen before, and the person sitting inside did not get out, did not buy coffee, did nothing except sit there, and she knew because she had lived in South Boston long enough to tell the difference between someone waiting for someone and someone watching someone, and the difference was in the eyes. People waiting looked at their phones or their watches. People watching looked at the door. The car came back the next day. Same place, same time. A different person sitting inside, but the same kind of gaze. And by the third day, Faye did not need a fourth day to understand that someone was observing her bakery in a systematic way, and she knew exactly because of whom. She waited for Beckett to come that afternoon, and when he walked in and headed toward the corner table as he always did, Faye did not bring out his coffee. She walked straight to his table, stood there, and looked at him with eyes he had never seen her use on him before. Not her usual direct gaze, but something sharper, colder, the gaze of someone who had just realized she had been dragged into a war she had never asked to join. "Outside," she said, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "Now." They stood in the narrow alley behind the bakery, beside the trash bins and the empty flour barrels, and Faye did not circle around the truth. "Someone is watching my bakery, for 3 days now, black car, changing people, same position. It's because of you. It was not a question. Faye, I saved you because I'm a decent person," she said, and her voice did not shake, but her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, and he realized she was controlling her anger with every ounce of strength she had. "I stitched you up on my kitchen floor. I gave you my bed. I didn't ask questions, didn't demand anything, didn't call the police, but I didn't sign any contract agreeing to become a target. I have an 8-year-old child sleeping 3 steps from where you were lying, Beckett. 8 years old. I'll protect you," he said. And he said it in the voice he used when he truly meant something and truly believed it. Low and firm and unshakable. "I'll handle this." Faye looked at him, and there was something on her face that he recognized as pain. Not the pain of anger, but the pain of disappointment. The pain of someone who had begun to believe in something she knew she shouldn't have believed in, and now that thing was showing her just how dangerous it was. "That is exactly what every dangerous man says before everything explodes," she said. "I'll protect you. I'll handle it. Trust me." And then one day someone knocks on my door, and Nell opens it, and it isn't you standing there. It's the person you promised to protect me from. And she stopped and drew a breath, and he saw that her eyes were red, but she did not cry, because Faye Brennan did not cry in front of anyone. She had learned that 3 years earlier, when she found her older sister on the bathroom floor and had to hold a 5-year-old child and say everything would be all right while nothing was all right at all. "Don't come here anymore," she said. "Please." And Beckett Cross, the man who did not take orders from anyone, the man who had built an empire by never backing down from anyone, stood in the alley beside the trash bins behind the bakery and listened to a woman who sold cakes say please, and he knew she was right and he was wrong. And that word please was heavier than any threat he had ever heard, because it came from someone who never begged anyone for anything. He left, without another word. Up on the 4th floor of the walk-up apartment, Nell stood at the living room window looking down, and she saw Beckett step out of the alley and walk along the sidewalk without looking back. And she opened her small notebook and wrote, "Auntie sent him away. Mistake. For 3 days, Beckett did not come. The corner table was empty. And every morning, Faye carried a cup of black coffee out and set it on the corner table out of habit, her hands doing it before her mind could stop them. Then she stood, looking at the cup for about 2 seconds, before taking it away and going back to work, and she said nothing about it. But Nell saw. Nell always saw. By the 3rd day, after school, Nell did not go back to the bakery as usual. She turned in a different direction and walked 4 blocks to the corner where she had written down the license plate of Conrad's black car from the first time he came to the apartment many weeks earlier, and she stood on that corner and waited. Because she had observed long enough to know that Conrad passed this corner twice a day to check the area around the bakery on Beckett's orders, even though Beckett no longer came there. Conrad appeared in the black car at 4:15, and when he saw the 8-year-old child standing alone on the corner and looking straight at his car, he stopped because of instinct, and also because of a curiosity he would never admit. Nell walked to the passenger side door. She did not open it. She only stood outside and spoke through the window Conrad had rolled down. "Mr. Conrad, you shouldn't be here alone," Conrad said. "Tell Mr. Beckett that Aunt Faye isn't angry," Nell said, and her voice was clear and certain, with nothing childish in it except the size of the person speaking. "She's scared. Those are 2 different things. Angry people send people away because they don't want to see them anymore. Scared people send people away because they're afraid of losing them. Mr. Beckett is smart enough to know which kind my aunt is." Conrad looked at the 8-year-old girl standing beside his car door, the afternoon wind blowing her pale blonde hair across her face, her sneakers worn down at the soles, her school backpack too large for her body, and he thought that in 52 years of living and 15 years of serving the Cross family, he had met many kinds of dangerous people, but he had never met anyone dangerous in this way. Dangerous in the way that only the smartest and most patient and most loving people could be dangerous. The kind of dangerous that changed everything it touched, not by force, but by truth. "I'll tell him," Conrad said. Nell nodded, turned around, and walked toward the bakery without looking back, and Conrad sat in the car watching her until she disappeared around the corner. Then he picked up his phone and called Beckett. Beckett returned to the bakery on Monday morning of the following week, not because of Conrad's call passing along Nell's words, though those words had stayed in his head for 3 straight nights, but because Pierce Alderman had made his next move, and this move was not aimed at a dark alley or a knife blade, but at paperwork, the weapon Pierce knew best. 2 of Beckett's 5 legitimate restaurants had received surprise audit notices from the Internal Revenue Service in the same week, and a shipping company Beckett owned through 3 layers of legal entities had been ordered by the Boston Port Authority to provide its transportation records for the most recent 12 months. And none of that was coincidence, because coincidence did not exist in this world. Only moves whose players you had not yet seen. Pierce was using the federal relationships he had cultivated since his Harvard days to squeeze Beckett through the law, and that was the hardest kind of attack to fight because you couldn't shoot a tax audit order. The war was heating up, and Beckett needed to understand every piece on the board before Pierce made his next move. And that was why, when Conrad placed a thin file on his desk on Sunday night and said, "There's something about your woman," Beckett did not correct the words, "your woman." He opened the file and read, and what he read changed everything. Colleen Brennan, Faye's older sister, had died 3 years earlier of an overdose, and for about 2 years she had been involved with a man named Dwight Harlan. Dwight Harlan, who had died 4 years earlier in a car accident that had never been properly investigated, had once been a mid-level member of the Cross organization, specifically the man who managed the books for the largest money laundering transaction in the history of both the Cross and Alderman families, a transaction carried out back when the 2 sides were still working together before they became enemies, a transaction large enough to destroy both empires if the evidence fell into the hands of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and that transaction data, those books, had disappeared with Dwight Harlan and had never been found. Beckett read the file twice, then closed it, and sat still for a very long time because, inside his head, he was assembling a picture he was not sure he wanted to see completed. Dwight knew everything. Dwight had been involved with Colleen. Colleen was dead. The data was missing. And now Colleen's younger sister was selling cakes in South Boston, and Colleen's niece was sitting across from him every week with a small notebook, writing everything down. He went to the bakery on Monday morning, and Faye looked at him as he walked in, and she did not smile, but she did not send him away either. She placed a cup of black coffee on the corner table without anyone asking, and he understood that this was Faye Brennan's way of saying, "I'm still here," without opening her mouth. He waited until the bakery was quiet, close to closing time, when Nell had gone home to do her homework and only the 2 of them remained, and then he asked her about Colleen. Faye was wiping the counter, and her hand stopped on the surface, and she did not lift her head for about 3 seconds. And when she did lift it, there was something in her eyes he had never seen there before. Not anger, not fear, but pain. The kind of pain she had put away so carefully that even she had forgotten where it was until someone called it by the right name. Colleen, Faye said, and the name in her mouth sounded like something sweet and bitter at the same time. What do you want to know? Everything you're willing to tell me, he said. Faye sat down in the chair across from him, and she told him, not in chronological order, but in emotional order, the way people truly remember the dead. She told him Colleen was beautiful, much more beautiful than she was. Beautiful in the kind of way that made people turn and look on the street. And Colleen knew it, and it did not help her at all. She told him Colleen was chaotic in the way some people are chaotic, because they feel everything too strongly and do not know how to turn down the volume. She told him Colleen loved Nell, truly loved her enough to name her daughter after their grandmother, and sing to her every night, and promise to get clean every month, and break that promise every month, and that love sometimes wasn't enough to save a person, if that person wasn't strong enough to save herself. She told him Colleen died on the bathroom floor of a weekly rental apartment in Roxbury on a Tuesday morning, and Faye was the one who found her because Colleen had not answered her phone for 2 days straight, and Faye had a spare key, and when Faye opened the bathroom door, Nell was sitting in the next room on the floor with a stuffed bear named Theodore, and the little girl was not crying. She was only sitting there and looking at Faye with blue eyes too quiet for a 5-year-old child who had just lost her mother, and she said, "Aunt Faye, Mommy won't wake up." Faye stopped there, and she looked down at the table and stayed silent for about 10 seconds, and Beckett said nothing because there was nothing to say when someone had just let you look into their deepest wound. Then he asked, and he knew this question would change the way she looked at him and might destroy the thing being built between them, but he needed to ask it. Did Colleen leave anything behind? Documents? Papers? A USB drive? Anything? Faye lifted her head and looked at him, and on her face, pain turned into something sharper, colder. "In what role are you asking me that?" she said. "The man who sits and drinks coffee with me every morning, or Boss Cross." And that question hit him exactly where she wanted it to hit, in the one place where he had no armor, because she was asking him whether everything between them had only been an investigation disguised as coffee and concern. "Both," he said, and he did not dodge it because Faye had taught him that between them there was only truth or there was nothing. "And I'm sorry for both." Faye looked at him for a very long time, long enough for him to see her deciding between sending him away a second time and believing that apology was real, and at last she said, "Colleen didn't leave anything. When she died, I cleaned out the apartment. There were only old clothes and Nell's things. No papers." She was telling the truth because she believed it was the truth. But on the 4th floor of the walk-up apartment, Nell Brennan was lying on her bed, holding the old stuffed bear named Theodore that she had held every night for 3 years since that Tuesday morning in Roxbury. The stuffed bear her mother had placed in her hands on the final night before everything ended, and said in a voice Nell would remember when she was 90 years old, "Hold on to Theodore, sweetheart. Never let Theodore go." Nell had not known why her mother said that at the time, but she knew her mother had sewn the bear's belly back up the night before with needle and thread and hidden something inside it. Something small that Nell could feel when she held him tightly. Something hard and flat lying between the layers of cotton stuffing. And she never opened it to look because her mother had said hold, not open, and Nell Brennan was the kind of person who kept the meaning of a word exactly, even when she did not understand why. The envelope arrived on Thursday morning by priority mail. Thick white paper of the kind used by major law firms, and inside were 2 typed pages bearing the letterhead of a firm on State Street that Faye had never heard of, but Beckett would recognize at once, because it was the law firm Pierce Alderman kept in his suit pocket the way other men kept a gun, ready to use when necessary and never leaving fingerprints behind. Notice of lease termination, effective in 30 days. The building where Faye's Bakery rented its space had been transferred to a new owner, and the new owner was exercising the right to terminate the agreement under Clause 4, subsection C of the original lease, which allowed the landlord to terminate unilaterally upon a change in ownership of the property, and everything was written in legal language so clean and polite that if you didn't know how to read between the lines, you would think this was only an ordinary real estate transaction, not a bullet fired through paperwork. Faye read those 2 pages 3 times, because the first time she didn't believe it, the second time she tried to find a loophole, and the third time she understood there wasn't one, because the person who wrote this notice wasn't the kind of person who left loopholes behind. Completely legal. Impossible to sue. Impossible to appeal. Pierce Alderman hadn't sent men to threaten her, hadn't burned down the bakery, hadn't done anything the police could call a crime. He had bought a building, signed a piece of paper, and erased her dream with the law, and that was exactly what made it crueler than any knife, because you can't fight something that's legal. Faye called Beckett from the bakery phone, and when he heard what she said, the other end of the line went silent in a way she had learned meant Beckett was thinking, not giving up. And after that silence, he said, "It's Pierce." And she said, "I know," because she wasn't stupid. And she knew no one bought a building just to evict one small bakery, unless that bakery meant something to someone the buyer wanted to hurt. "He wants me to react recklessly," Beckett said. "And I lose the bakery whether you react or not," Faye said, and her voice was so flat that he knew she was controlling something inside herself with all the strength she had. She spent the next 30 days packing, 30 days to put every cake pan, every flour sifter, every mismatched ceramic mug she had bought from the thrift store into cardboard boxes, and every item she placed inside a box was a small piece of the only dream she had allowed herself to dream in 3 years of struggle. The dream Nell had spoken for her in front of Beckett in that small kitchen, the dream that had become real for 4 brief months and was now being folded up and tucked into cardboard boxes as if it had never existed. The final day, the bakery was empty. The glass display counter had been taken apart, the tables and chairs had been moved away, the blackboard on which Faye had written "fresh cakes" in chalk leaned against the corner of the wall, and on the floor there were only the last few cardboard boxes, the fading smell of flour, and the fluorescent lights shining down on the empty room with the cold, pitiless white glow fluorescent lights always have when there is nothing left for them to illuminate. Faye sat on the floor among the boxes at 11 o'clock at night. Because she had waited for Nell to fall asleep, she had made sure Nell was asleep. She had stood at Nell's bedroom door and listened to the child's steady breathing for about 2 minutes before going downstairs to the bakery one last time. Because she needed a place to do the thing she had not allowed herself to do in front of anyone for the past 3 years. She cried. Not a quiet cry, not a restrained cry, but the kind of crying the whole body takes part in, shoulders shaking, hands covering the face, breath breaking apart. The kind of crying you can only do when you think no one can see you, because if anyone sees you, you'll have to explain, and explaining means admitting, and admitting means collapsing. And Faye Brennan had not allowed herself to collapse since that Tuesday morning in Roxbury when she held her 5-year-old niece and said everything would be all right. But Nell wasn't asleep. Nell had waited for the sound of her aunt's footsteps going down the stairs before opening her eyes, because Nell Brennan had learned how to pretend to sleep when she was still living with her mother, a skill no child should ever need to learn. But she had learned it because she had to, and she walked barefoot down the stairs without making a sound, and stood at the bakery door and looked through the glass slit and saw her aunt sitting on the floor among the boxes, crying. Nell stood there for a very long time, long enough for the streetlight outside to change from green to red and back to green twice, and she did not go in because she understood with a too-old instinct that Aunt Faye needed to cry alone, and that was her right, and the little girl stood at the door and watched the only woman in the world who loved her breaking down because the world had taken away the last thing she had. And in Nell's blue eyes, something changed. Not tears because Nell did not cry, but decision. The quiet and absolute kind of decision only people who have lost enough can make. The kind of decision that, once made, cannot be taken back. She went back upstairs, lay down on her bed, pulled Theodore into her arms, and felt the small, hard, flat thing inside the stuffed bear's belly. The thing she had felt every night for 3 years without ever opening it to look. Tonight, she still did not open it. But tonight, she knew she would use it. On Saturday morning, Nell woke at 6 o'clock, put on jeans and a jacket and her sneakers with the worn-down soles, took Theodore from the bed, and tucked him into her school backpack, then wrote a small note and left it on the kitchen table for Aunt Faye. "I'm going to the library early. I'll be back before noon," because she knew that if she told the truth, her aunt would stop her. And if her aunt stopped her, everything would stay stuck in place forever, and her aunt would keep crying on the floor of the empty bakery every night until there was nothing left to cry over. She walked 12 blocks to the coffee shop on West Broadway where she knew Beckett sat on Saturday mornings, because she had written down his habits in her notebook weeks earlier. Saturday, 8 o'clock in the morning, table by the window, black coffee, no sugar, sitting alone, Conrad waiting in the car outside. She arrived at 7:45 and waited across the street until she saw the familiar black car pull up and Beckett step into the shop. Then she waited another 5 minutes for him to order his coffee and sit down. Then she crossed the street, pushed open the coffee shop door, walked straight to his table, and sat down in the chair across from him as if she had an appointment scheduled in advance. Beckett looked at her, and he wasn't surprised that Nell Brennan had appeared there. He was surprised by the expression on her face, because for the first time since he had met her in the fourth-floor apartment months ago, she wasn't playing the well-behaved child or measuring him or playing the long game. She was serious, in the way adults are serious when they are about to put everything on the table. Nell opened her backpack, took out Theodore, and placed the stuffed bear on the tabletop between his coffee cup and the napkin holder. Theodore looked exactly like what he was, an old stuffed bear loved almost to the point of falling apart, his fur faded gray, one eye slightly loose, the seam across his belly unevenly stitched by hand, and if you didn't know better, you would think he was only an old toy a poor child couldn't bear to throw away. But Beckett looked at the stuffed bear and at the seam across the belly, and he knew with the instinct of a man who had spent 8 years searching for things other people hid, that something was inside. "My mother hid something in here," Nell said, and her voice was so calm that if he closed his eyes, he would think he was speaking to an adult. "I don't know what it is, but I know it's important because my mother sewed Theodore's belly shut the night before she died and told me never to let Theodore go. My mother never sewed anything. She hated needles and thread. So if my mother sewed, then whatever is inside must be very important." She paused. "I've kept it for 3 years. Beckett looked at Theodore, looked at Nell, looked back at Theodore. "I want to trade," Nell said, and the word trade in her mouth did not sound like the word a child used when swapping toys on a playground. It sounded like the word trade at the negotiating tables where he had sat hundreds of times, except the person sitting across from him was not even 4'3" and was negotiating with a stuffed bear. "Trade for what?" he asked, and he asked very softly, softer than he spoke to anyone in his organization, because he realized this moment was fragile in a way that no amount of money or power could protect if he said the wrong word. "Aunt Faye," Nell said. "Me," a pause. "Safe," a pause. "Forever. 4 things. Not money, not a house, not new clothes or new shoes or a better school. Aunt Faye, me, safe, forever." That was all an 8-year-old child wanted. And it was all Beckett Cross's 8 years of power had never been enough to buy for himself. Beckett looked at the little girl sitting across from him, the 8-year-old child negotiating with a weapon she did not fully understand the strength of, but understood enough of its value to know it might buy her what she needed. Blue eyes steady, voice unbroken, back straight in a coffee shop chair too high for her feet, and he felt something happen inside his chest, not loudly, not dramatically, just something breaking open very softly and very slowly, like a crack in the wall he had spent 8 years building. The wall he had built from distance and control, and never letting anyone come close enough to hurt him. And now an 8-year-old child with an old stuffed bear had done what no enemy, and no ally, and no one in the past 8 years had managed to do. She had found the crack and stepped through it. He reached out and gently pushed Theodore back toward Nell. "Keep Theodore," he said. "I don't need a trade to protect you and your aunt." Nell looked at him, and she did not move for about 5 seconds. 5 seconds in which she was processing something she had not expected, because in every scenario she had calculated in her head, the scenario where he refused to take it and still protected them had not been on the list, because her short 8 years of experience in the world had taught her that no one gave anything for free and everything had a price. And now a man she knew was the most dangerous man in the city was telling her that her safety had no price. Nell put Theodore back into her backpack. Then she opened the small notebook, the notebook that had been with her since the first night in the Dorchester alley, the notebook that held every observation, every note, every calculation she had made over the past several months. and she wrote 4 words in pencil on a new page. This time, she did not cover them. This time, she turned the notebook around so he could see, and on the lined paper, in the neat round handwriting of an 8-year-old child, were 4 words. "He really is good." Beckett read those 4 words, and he said nothing, and he didn't need to say anything, because those 4 words carried more weight than any contract he had ever signed, and he understood that this was not an observation, but a verdict. The final verdict from the 8-year-old girl who had spent months judging him with eyes that missed nothing. And she had decided he could be trusted. And he sat in the coffee shop on a Saturday morning in South Boston, looking at those 4 penciled words, and thought that in his entire 36 years of life, no one had ever said anything to him that mattered more than that. Beckett brought Theodore back to the penthouse that night, not because he had taken him from Nell, but because after the conversation at the coffee shop, the little girl had given the stuffed bear to him willingly, not as a trade, but as an act of trust. The way a child gives the most precious thing she owns to the person she has decided won't disappoint her, and Beckett held Theodore in both hands more carefully than anything he had ever held, because he understood that this stuffed bear was 3 years of memory, the last night with a mother, the last sentence that mother had spoken, and it weighed more than everything he owned. He sat at the desk in the dark penthouse and used a small knife to cut open the seam in Theodore's belly very slowly, very carefully, because he didn't want to damage the stuffed bear any more than necessary. And inside the old stuffing that had clumped together after 3 years of being held every night was a small USB wrapped in a piece of plastic, and when he plugged the USB into the computer and opened it, he understood why Dwight Harlan had died, and why Colleen Brennan had died, and why this USB had been missing for 4 years without either family being able to find it. Inside was everything. The books for the largest money laundering transaction in the history of both the Cross and Alderman families, every payment in detail, every account, every shell company, every intermediary bank in Cayman and Zurich and Delaware, every number, every date, every signature. Enough for the Federal Bureau of Investigation to open at least 20 federal cases. Enough for the Internal Revenue Service to freeze the assets of both empires. Enough for the 3 largest newsrooms in the country to run it on the front page for an entire month. If this data got out, the Alderman family would fall. And the Cross family would fall too. Beckett sat looking at the computer screen for about 10 minutes, and in those 10 minutes, he saw 3 roads clearly in front of him. 1. Destroy the USB and keep the game as it had always been. 2. Send it to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and destroy Pierce, but destroy himself as well. And 3. Use it as leverage, turning the nuclear bomb into mutual destruction, the way 2 superpowers kept peace by making sure that if one side died, the other died with it. He chose the 3rd road. He copied all the data onto a second hard drive, sent that copy to his private attorney in New York by special courier with a sealed letter that was only to be opened if Beckett Cross died or disappeared, or if anyone named on the attached list was harmed. And that list had 2 names, Faye Brennan and Nell Brennan. Then, he called Pierce Alderman. The meeting took place the next night at an Italian restaurant in the North End that Beckett owned and had closed for the evening. No one there except the 2 of them. No bodyguards, no witnesses, only 2 crime bosses sitting across from each other at a table covered in white cloth with 2 glasses of water that neither man drank. Pierce Alderman sat there, 40 years old, slicked back hair, tailored gray suit, silk tie, calm to the point of almost looking sleepy, because Pierce always looked as though he were in the most boring meeting in the world until he destroyed someone. And Beckett placed the USB on the table between the 2 glasses of water and said, "Open it and look." Pierce opened his laptop and plugged in the USB and read, and in the 30 seconds while Pierce was reading, Beckett saw something very few people in the world had ever been allowed to see. Pierce Alderman losing control of his expression. Only 30 seconds. Then his face closed again like the door of a safe. "This is a copy," Beckett said. "The original is in the hands of my attorney in New York, inside a sealed envelope with clear instructions. If I die, if I disappear, if anyone connected to me is harmed in any way, the envelope is opened, and the contents are sent simultaneously to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Internal Revenue Service, and 3 newsrooms." He paused. This data destroys you. It destroys me too. You know that because you just read it. Pierce looked at Beckett, and on his face there was none of the anger Beckett had predicted, only the cold calculation of a man who had just realized that the chess game was over, not because anyone had won, but because both sides had enough weapons to ensure that victory was impossible. "Pull out of South Boston," Beckett said. "Return the building. Never touch anything or anyone that belongs to me again." "And the reverse," Pierce said, because Pierce was the kind of man who always made sure an agreement ran both ways. "And the reverse." Beckett agreed. Pierce closed the laptop, stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked to the door without shaking hands, without saying goodbye, without looking back, and the restaurant door closed behind him, and the war ended, not with blood, not with bullets, but with 4 kilobytes of data inside a USB that had been hidden in the belly of a stuffed bear for 3 years. The following week, Faye's bakery lease was restored by the building's new owner after Beckett bought the property back from Pierce's shell company, and Faye received an envelope for the second time in her life from someone who did not put a name on it. This time, inside was a new 10-year lease instead of a 5-year one, and she sat at the kitchen table looking at the stack of papers and did not cry this time, only closed her eyes for a very long while and breathed very deeply, and when she opened her eyes, Nell was sitting across from her, looking at her, and aunt and niece looked at each other and did not need to say anything. But the price Beckett paid was not the money he spent to buy the building. The price was greater than that, because when he sat in the penthouse that night after the meeting with Pierce and looked out at the city through the glass wall and thought about the 4 words, "He really is good," in the small notebook, he understood that he could not both be worthy of those 4 words and keep living the way he had lived for the past 8 years, and he began doing the thing Conrad noticed first and needed a few seconds to believe. Beckett began dismantling. Not dismantling the empire, but dismantling the darkness inside the empire, one piece at a time, one operation at a time, gradually moving into legitimacy, cutting away the branches he knew could not survive in the light. Conrad stood in the office watching Beckett sign the order to shut down 2 transport routes he knew were the most profitable, and he said in a voice that was not judgmental but needed to be spoken, "You're changing everything because of a child and a woman." Beckett did not lift his eyes from the papers. "I'm changing because, for the first time, I have a reason to want to see tomorrow," he said. And he said it as if stating an obvious truth. Not because he had suddenly become a good man. Beckett Cross knew he wasn't a good man, and perhaps he would never be completely good, because you don't do what he had done for 8 years and wash your hands clean. But he could become more worthy, and more worthy was enough. Worthy of the 4 words written in pencil in a small notebook by an 8-year-old girl who had looked into his eyes and decided he could be trusted, and Beckett Cross would die before he proved her wrong. The bakery reopened on a Monday morning at the beginning of the month, and when Faye unlocked the door at 7 o'clock in the morning and turned on the oven for the first time after 6 weeks of being closed, the smell of butter melting in the oven and sugar lightly browning on the tops of the cakes spilled out onto the sidewalk, blending with the cold South Boston morning air into a scent that made Faye stand behind the counter, breathe it in, and stop for a moment, because it smelled like something she had thought she had lost, not flour or sugar or butter, but hope. And it turned out hope smelled exactly like her bakery at 7 o'clock in the morning when the oven had just warmed. A month had passed since Pierce backed away, and during that month everything changed in ways Faye could feel even though no one explained them to her. The black car no longer parked across the street. No one watched the bakery anymore. The new lease lay secure in the drawer for 10 years, and Beckett came more regularly than before, not once every 3 or 4 days, but almost every morning. And every morning he sat at the corner table, and every morning she brought him black coffee, and the distance between them had slowly narrowed over the weeks, in a way they both knew but neither named. Narrowed through the mornings when he came earlier than usual and sat waiting for her to open. Narrowed through the afternoons when he stayed after closing and helped her stack the chairs on the tables without being asked. Narrowed through the evening when he sat on the kitchen floor in the 4th-floor apartment, teaching Nell multiplication, because she was struggling at school, and he had discovered it, not because anyone told him, but because he saw her math notebook open on the table and the numbers crossed out again and again. Narrowed through the week, when he brought Nell 3 new books every week, because he remembered she finished a thick book in 2 days, and he knew the neighborhood library was closed on weekends. Narrowed through the afternoon, Faye came home and found the sink pipe already fixed, even though she had not asked anyone. And she knew exactly who had done it because Nell said, "Mr. Beckett fixed it this morning. He said not to tell you, but I think you should know." The distance narrowed until the only thing left between them was physical distance. The kitchen counter between where she stood and where he sat. The table between 2 cups of coffee. The small stretch of air they both felt every time their hands accidentally touched when she set his cup down. That morning, the bakery was quiet, 9 o'clock on a weekday, with only one regular customer already gone and Nell at school, and Beckett sat at the corner table with his coffee gone cold, watching Faye wipe the counter. And he said the thing he had been thinking for weeks but had never said, because saying it meant admitting it, and admitting it meant opening a door he was not sure he could close again. "Faye." She looked up. "I spent 8 years building a system whose core principle was never allowing anyone close enough to hurt me," he said. And his voice was not the voice of Boss Cross giving orders or negotiating. It was the voice of a man telling the truth, and telling the truth was costing him more strength than any war he had ever fought. No wife. No children. No one in the penthouse but me. No one knowing what I like, what I fear, what I want. That was the system. And it worked. It kept me alive. He stopped. "You and Nell broke that system. And you didn't even have to try. You only had to give me coffee and tell me the truth, and that little girl only had to sit across from me and read books and ask me whether I wanted children, and an 8-year system collapsed." Faye set the cloth down on the counter and she looked at him, and there was no surprise on her face because Faye Brennan wasn't the kind of woman who was surprised when someone finally said aloud what she had known for a long time. She only waited for him to reach that place on his own feet instead of dragging him there. "I know who you are," she said, and her voice was calm, but her eyes were not. Her eyes held something warm and cautious at the same time. Cautious because life had taught her that opening your heart was reckless, and warm because she had decided to be reckless. "I know what you've done. I'm not pretending that part doesn't exist. But I also saw you sitting on my kitchen floor teaching Nell multiplication on a Tuesday night. I saw you bring her books every week because you know she reads faster than the library stays open. I saw you fix my pipes without anyone asking because you didn't want me to know, because you didn't want me to feel indebted." She paused. "I don't love the name. I don't love the empire. I don't love the penthouse or the black cars or anything that comes with that name. I love the man sitting on my kitchen floor." Beckett looked at her from the corner table, and the distance between him and her was 7 steps around the kitchen counter, and he had walked more dangerous roads than that in his life. But those 7 steps frightened him more than all of them, because there was no road back from those 7 steps. He stood, walked around the kitchen counter. 7 steps. And he stood before her, close enough to see the dusting of flour on her forehead that she didn't know was there, close enough to smell sugar and butter and coffee on the apron she was wearing, close enough to see her eyes looking up into his without blinking. He kissed her, gently, slowly. Honestly, in a way Beckett Cross rarely did anything, because honesty was the greatest luxury in his world, and that kiss had weight, not the weight of passion or hurry, but the weight of everything that had led to it, of the Dorchester alley and the kitchen floor and sewing thread and the cup of coffee every morning, and the 4 words written in pencil, and the bakery opening, then closing, then opening again, and 8 years of loneliness meeting, 3 years of loneliness, and both of them realizing that loneliness was not a life sentence if you found the right person. Faye kissed him back, her hand resting on his chest, not pushing him away, not pulling him closer, only resting there, and beneath her palm was the heartbeat of the most dangerous man in the city, beating faster than usual, and she felt it, and she knew it was the truest thing he had ever shown her. That afternoon, Beckett went to the back of the bakery and found Nell sitting on the concrete steps leading down to the rear alley, sitting the way she always sat when no one was watching. Back, slightly hunched, knees drawn up, her small notebook resting on her lap but unopened, and the stuffed bear Theodore, whose belly Beckett had carefully stitched back together and returned to her, lying beside her backpack, while she looked down at the alley below without really looking at anything. in the way children look when they're thinking thoughts too large for their small heads. He didn't sit down right away. He stood at the back door and looked at her and thought about all the months that had passed, about the first cinnamon pastry, about the books, about the question, "Do you want children?" About the word "yet" in the penthouse, about Theodore on the coffee shop table, and he thought that before he spoke to Faye, he needed to speak to Nell, because Nell was the one who had started all of it. Nell was the one who had found him in the alley. Nell was the one who had run to get Faye. Nell was the one who had negotiated on the kitchen floor. Nell was the one who had played the long game that he had allowed her to win, and she deserved to hear the truth first. "Nell," he said. She turned back, and when she saw him standing in the doorway, there was a quick expression on her face that he almost missed. Hope. It flashed in her blue eyes for about half a second, then vanished beneath the familiar calm she wore like armor, but that half-second was enough for him to know that beneath all the tricks and calculations, and being too grown up too soon, Nell Brennan was still an 8-year-old child hoping, and hope was the most fragile and most courageous thing a child who had lost her mother could hold on to. He stepped out and sat down on the step beside her, not too close because he knew Nell needed space, but close enough for her to know he was there. "You know I'm not taking you in just because you're good, right?" he said. That question struck Nell like something she had not prepared herself to block. He saw it happen in layers. First, her eyes widened a little. Then her lower lip trembled, very slightly. Then her blue eyes began to redden from the outer edges inward, and for the first time since he had met her, for the first time in all these months, the perfect shell Nell Brennan had built out of silence and obedience and false adulthood began to crack. Not shatter, only crack, but that crack let him see inside. And inside was an 8-year-old child, afraid that the only adult besides Aunt Faye she trusted had just seen through everything she had tried so hard to do and would be angry. "I noticed every little trick," he said, and his voice was gentle in a way Conrad would not have recognized, because Conrad had never heard Beckett Cross use this voice. "From the first cinnamon pastry, you watched me try different kinds, then brought me exactly the kind I liked the next time. From the first question about books, you didn't ask because you were curious. You asked because you wanted to create something the two of us had in common. From the way you always appeared at exactly the right time when I came and disappeared at exactly the right time when I left, so I would never feel pushed." He paused. "I saw all of it, from the beginning." Nell looked down at the concrete step, and her hands gripped the edge of the small notebook, and she said 2 words in a voice he had never heard from her before, small and trembling, and like a real 8-year-old child, instead of the miniature adult she had been pretending to be for so long. "I'm sorry." Don't apologize," Beckett said, and he said it at once, without hesitation, because he needed her to hear this before she could think she had done something wrong. "You're 8 years old. You lost your mother. You live in a walk-up apartment with your aunt, and the two of you have nothing except each other. And you looked around and saw that the world doesn't give anyone anything for free, and you decided you were going to find a way to protect your family yourself." He paused. "That is the bravest thing I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot in 36 years. Nell was still looking down, and tears ran along her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away because her hands were still holding the notebook like a lifeline, and Beckett sat beside her on the step, closer than before, his shoulder about 1 handspan from hers. "Nell," he said, and she lifted her head and looked at him with blue eyes that were red and wet and had no armor left in them anymore, only a child looking at an adult and feeling afraid and hopeful at the same time. "I'm not taking you in because you're good. I'm not taking you in because you're smart. I'm not taking you in because you saved my life in that alley." He stopped and drew a breath, and Nell looked at him and waited, and the world shrank until there was nothing left but the concrete steps behind the bakery and the two of them sitting side by side. "I'm taking you in because I want to, because my life is better with you in it, because I lived 36 years without knowing what I was missing, until an 8-year-old girl sat across from me in a bakery and asked me whether I wanted children." He looked at her. "If you want that." Nell Brennan, the child who had not cried when her mother died, had not cried when her aunt cried on the floor of the empty bakery, had not cried through 3 years of living by silence and observation and calculation and patience, cried, not quietly, not with restraint, but in the way children cry when they are finally allowed to put down something they have carried for too long, tears falling freely, shoulders trembling softly, and she did not wipe them away because she did not need to hide from anyone anymore. She leaned toward him and rested against his shoulder, and Beckett Cross, the man who had spent 8 years building walls around himself, did not move. He only sat there and let her lean on him, and he felt the weight of her against his shoulder, so light it was almost nothing, yet so heavy he knew it would remain there for the rest of his life. Then Nell sat up straight, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, opened the small notebook to the last blank page, took a pencil from the pocket of her jacket, and wrote. When she finished, she turned the notebook toward him, not for him to read secretly this time, but for him to read officially, and on the lined page, in the neat round pencil handwriting of an 8-year-old child, were 2 words, the simplest 2 words in every language, and the heaviest 2 words in every language, and Beckett read them, and something inside his chest did not break this time, but was built back up, built from something he had no name for, but it was warm and it was solid, and it had the shape of 2 penciled words. Home now. 6 months later, the penthouse on Harbor Boulevard no longer looked like the penthouse Faye had first stepped into and called beautiful but lonely, because now it was beautiful and not lonely, and the difference lay in the small details Beckett Cross had never imagined would exist in his living space, but now couldn't imagine that space without. The enormous bookshelf in the office was still full of books, but now the entire bottom shelf was children's books, arranged in alphabetical order because Nell insisted that books had to be organized properly, and Beckett agreed because he also arranged books in alphabetical order. And that was one of the small things he discovered they shared, in a way that made him smile every time he thought about it. There was flour on the marble counter in the kitchen because, even after a long day of running her successful bakery, Faye still loved to bake for her family on weekends, and she never wiped all the flour away because she said flour on the counter meant someone was living here, not displaying the place, and Beckett didn't argue because she was right. The stainless steel refrigerator, expensive enough to cost as much as an average car, now had Nell's math test attached to it with a cat-shaped magnet Nell had bought at the dollar store with her allowance, the math test with the highest score in the class, and Beckett had looked at that test every morning when he opened the refrigerator to get milk for his coffee for 3 weeks now, and had not taken it down, because every time he saw it, he remembered the nights he had sat on the kitchen floor of the 4th-floor apartment teaching Nell multiplication. And he thought that, out of everything he had achieved in 36 years, the math test held to the refrigerator by a cat-shaped magnet was the thing that made him proudest. On the shelf in the office, beside the business files and contracts and legal papers, was Theodore, the old stuffed bear with faded gray fur, one slightly loose eye, and the seam across his belly that Beckett had carefully stitched back together, empty inside now because the USB was now safely locked in a high-security vault alongside the attorney's copy, acting as a permanent insurance policy for their peace. But Beckett kept Theodore on the shelf because Nell said, "Theodore needs a better home than a bear's belly," and because Theodore was no longer a hiding place for secrets, but had become what he had always been to Nell, the last thing her mother had left behind, and that deserved a place on the oak shelf in the penthouse office, not inside a worn school backpack. Tonight, the sky was clear, and the city of Boston spread beneath the glass wall like a carpet of light, and Nell sat on the sofa in the living room, her feet resting near Theodore on the floor beside the sofa, reading the new book Beckett had bought for her the previous week, book number 107 since he had started counting, and she read with the quiet focus he had come to know and love. The small notebook was no longer on her lap. It was in the drawer of the study desk in Nell's own room, the room Beckett had turned from a spare sitting room into a bedroom with its own bookshelf and its own desk, and a night lamp Nell had chosen herself. Not a butterfly-shaped lamp, but a proper reading lamp, because Nell said she needed good light to read at night, and Beckett bought her the most expensive one he could find, because he had discovered that buying things for Nell made him happy in a way buying things for himself never had. The notebook lay in the drawer because Nell no longer needed to write everything down. She had kept notes when she needed to understand the world around her and find a way to survive in it, and now she didn't need to survive anymore. She only needed to live. Faye stood beside Beckett at the glass wall, her shoulder resting against his arm, and she looked out at the city below, and the lights reflected in her eyes made them brighter, and her hands were no longer red and cracked from chemicals. Her hands now had flour beneath the nails and the scent of vanilla on the skin, and those were the hands of someone building instead of merely surviving. "Still lonely?" she asked, echoing the sentence she had spoken the first time she entered this penthouse many months ago. And this time, there was a smile in her voice, even though she did not smile on her face. "No," Beckett said, "not anymore." And he said it simply because it was true, and because between the two of them, truth was the only currency with any value and always had been since the day she set a cup of coffee down on the corner table and said, "If we're going to talk, then we talk honestly, or we don't talk at all." Below them, the city glowed and moved and lived, beautiful and dangerous and real. Not perfect, but enough. More than enough. Enough in the way only people who have known what not enough feels like can truly understand the value of it. And sometimes life does not give you what you want in the way you want it, but gives you what you need in a way you never expected. Sometimes that thing is an 8-year-old child who finds you bleeding in a dark alley and, instead of walking away, decides that you are worth saving, not because you are good, but because she sees in you something you have forgotten how to see in yourself, that beneath the concrete and power and loneliness, there is still a human being waiting for someone brave enough to knock on the door. This story is not about the mafia, or power, or violence. It is about how sometimes the smallest people are the ones who can change the world, about how kindness is not weakness but the strongest weapon human beings possess, about how family is not always made of people who share the same blood, but sometimes of people who choose one another in the darkness and decide to walk into the light together. If this story touched something inside you, please press the like button so I know it has reached the place it was meant to reach. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it today. And subscribe to our channel so we can keep listening to more stories every day. Because this is only the beginning, and there are still so many stories waiting to be told. I would truly love to hear your own feelings. What did this story bring up for you? Who did it remind you of in real life? Was there any moment that made you pause and think? Please leave a comment below, because every line you write is motivation for us to keep bringing you stories that touch the heart. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.